And now we're going to move on to Professor Helen Milroy, who's the Commissioner for the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, who has flown here from Perth. I'm not quite sure what time it is now for you, Helen. She's woken up at 4:30, well, 7:30 was when she woke up this morning, but she's here because she's going to give us a keynote address on safe passage, I love that term, through mental health services, key learnings from the Royal Commission on prevalence and impacts of trauma for people accessing mental health services, and the risks of re-traumatization through breaches of sexual safety. Please join me in welcoming Professor Helen Milroy. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lynn, for inviting me to come and speak today. And, I'm just going to have to say it. Why don't we deal with this? Some of us have been in this area for decades. I certainly started out as a young doctor working in sexual assault services in the Children's Hospital in the 80s. And yet we still don't deal with it. What's the fundamental problem that we seem to be missing, given we know that these things occurred, have been occurring since beginning of time, I guess, and still occurring today at such high rates and have such devastating impacts? And I can only conclude that it is such a taboo area still in society, that it creates such emotional distress for everybody in the system, whether it be the person who's raising the issue or the person dealing with the issue, that the easiest response is denial and disbelief. We've really got to tackle this fundamental attitude in society that we don't want to know about this stuff, because it's not going to go away. Okay, so having said that, it was nice to have the welcome to country this morning, and I just wanted to acknowledge the Kulin Nation and the sacred ground that we're on. It's a beautiful venue, isn't it? And just to remind us that underneath the ground we're standing on is thousands and thousands of years of Aboriginal history. I also wanted to just make a couple of comments about the previous speakers, and thank you to the last speaker. You've said a lot of what I'm already going to say, so it makes my job a bit easier. When we talk about learning from complaints, I think sometimes we see complaints as a very negative thing. Complaints are actually how we learn what's happening and how we can actually improve our services. And we almost need a new language for them, because that whole idea of making a complaint means that you're complaining, and it has a negative emotional connotation to it, whereas in actual fact it's raising a serious concern about the risks and safety to the person and to other people within those units. In terms of safety and the idea of sort of gender safety and single-sex wards and all of that, I'll also raise some issues just about men, because we actually saw predominantly men in the Royal Commission. And the other thing I wanted to say is that if we don't take these concerns and complaints seriously, we are actually putting other people at risk. If we don't actually deal with them, then all you're doing is waiting for the next complaint or concern to be raised, because it's going to happen again. These things rarely happen in isolation. They're often a repeated pattern of behaviour that can go on for a very long time. And one of the other issues I think that a lot of people did raise with us throughout the Commission was this idea that they wouldn't be believed. So what we often have is we have disclosures of assault, or talking about assault in a very clumsy way. Disclosures are never straightforward. They're often piecemeal, and they often test the water first. So if you don't deal with the superficial layer, you're never ever going to get to the underlying layers. Okay. I also just wanted to say that it's important to actually have a look at some of the work we've done in the Royal Commission. It was a 5-year inquiry. We went all over Australia. We saw lots and lots of people. And we saw a lot of people who are currently your consumers accessing mental health services. And as a psychiatrist on that inquiry, I felt embarrassed that we were doing so badly. We really were. There weren't many sessions that I sat in where people gave a glowing report on their mental health service. And it was embarrassing to think, my goodness, we've just got this so wrong and we're still not doing it very well. So I think it's really important with some of the stuff we're going to talk about today and in my presentation that we do understand the developmental nature of trauma and how trauma does impact on multiple domains of development, which is why it's so complex by the time you get to adulthood if it's untreated, undisclosed or unacknowledged. And it's often compounded trauma that you're seeing, not just a single event. So you always have to look at what's lying underneath. The other thing, I suppose, just off the top of my head in regard to this particular setting and what we're talking about today in regard to the report, is that there's such a complex interplay between developmental trauma, mental illness, acute distress, inpatient settings. How do you really know how to judge all of that? I think sometimes we rely too much on what we think in our own judgments instead of actually following protocols and procedures that are set out for us to try and keep everybody safe. And we need to take sometimes the judgment out of it. So we can do better. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found with the Commission and then some of those other things at the end. So our terms of reference was to better protect children, to achieve best practice in reporting and responding to reports of child sexual abuse, and then of course to ensure some justice and to alleviate the impacts. And our 3 pillars in the Commission were private sessions, public hearings, policy. I'm assuming some of you probably watched some of the public hearings or engaged in some of the issues papers. I hope you did. It was sustained in the media for at least 5 years, so I'm hoping that you have some knowledge of what we did. During our 5-year inquiry, this was just some of the data quickly, over about 8,000 individual stories, plus all our public hearings. Quite a few matters went to the police. Some of them did result ultimately in convictions. And what was interesting about some of those matters we did refer to the police is that those matters had actually been known about for a long time, but they didn't actually result in any further action until they were then reported later, with a sort of a stronger emphasis on taking it forward. So previously we haven't dealt very well with these sorts of matters. We held private sessions in every capital city, regional locations, and we also visited all the prisons. And of course we did see women prisoners, but predominantly we saw a lot of male prisoners in the prison system. And I really have to reflect that had we not failed them so badly as children, had we not failed them so badly as young men, they may not have been in the situation they found themselves in, with very, very serious crimes and life in jail. We did 57 public hearings, millions of documents, and examined lots of institutions. By the way, we did have one public hearing focused on health settings, but we also heard a lot of complaints about psychiatric settings as well from individuals, and in particular the adolescent units, but also children in adult units. Okay. Lots of issues papers, lots of submissions. We did roundtables. We had community forums, and we also had some consultations with young people as well, which included teenagers and that younger adult age group. We published 59 research reports, and they're all available on the web. So some of the data around who we saw. What was interesting about this inquiry was that we actually saw a lot of men. And I think that sometimes in the area of sex, I'm not saying I don't want to in any way disregard women, because women clearly have had a lot of issues in this particular area, but I think the voice of men sometimes hasn't been heard, and there's a number of issues around that. I think men are probably less likely to report, and there's a whole pile of other issues, given that predominantly the perpetrators are male, around their sexual identity and other sorts of issues around masculinity, which are quite different from women. But we did see a lot of men, about 15% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. We did see a section from the disability community. And most of these kids, because it was an institutional setting, were in that sort of primary school age, but we did hear stories right from early childhood, infancy, right through to all across the decades, and also from people reporting. People reported both in childhood, as well as we had people in their 90s reporting for the first time. So we saw all decades. So often people talked about abuse going on for at least a couple of years. So these are chronic forms of trauma. And sometimes the abuse actually went right through into adulthood and then on to the next generation. So some of the people that you're seeing in your services are still in situations of abuse. And so when abuse occurs within an inpatient setting, it may be on the background of present trauma. And that may not even be understood at the time when the incident's reported. And of course, most people told us they were abused on multiple occasions as well. So these are very severe forms of trauma. And again, multiple perpetrators as well. Which again I think leads into some of the issues and the complexity that we see in adult services. For a lot of people that, as adults reporting to us about their experiences through services as children, adolescents and young adults, they felt nowhere was safe. Nowhere in society was safe. So how do we make sure that we overcome that within the care environment we're meant to be providing? Quite a few survivors told us they were abused within religious organisations, as well as government and non-government. But we were told about over nearly 3,500 institutions were complained about, so it's just about everywhere, basically. Anywhere where there were children in a situation of care, there was the possibility for exploitation or abuse. So in terms of just understanding impacts generally, the impacts of child sexual abuse are different, obviously, for each person that came to speak with us. But the impacts are complex and interconnected, that affects many areas of a person's life, and that the institutional responses, so how people responded when they found out, was just as significant. And for some people they said it was actually completely devastating when they got a negative response to their disclosures. And of course we know that sexual abuse has ripple effects right across families. It's both a vertical and a horizontal effect, so it goes right across the family. It also goes on to the next generation. It can go on to many generations. So they're complex and profound, the impacts. They're difficult to isolate one impact from another. They differ by individual, of course, as we know from the literature. They do change over time. So I think that we tend to see if someone's okay, then that's fine, we can forget about it. But impacts may actually occur later on down the track. So a child might look okay for a few years and then they hit adolescence and there's a trigger event or a developmental stage and they completely fall off the planet. And that can happen in adulthood as well. For some of the men, they didn't really have their major decompensation until they were in their 50s. And they started to actually decline in their physical strength and prowess, and that sense of being able to protect themselves was no longer there. And sometimes they had a major decompensation at that point in their life, having never disclosed or dealt with a trauma prior to that. Another event that can occur, of course, is pregnancy and parenthood, which are very, very powerful rekindlers of past trauma. And it's cumulative over the life stage as well. It's also influenced by many other factors which are there. So these slides will all be available, so we'll go across them pretty quick. What people told us in the private sessions, most people described mental health impacts, and across almost all areas of kind of diagnostic categories. And I'm with you on the no borderline personality disorder label. I think it's unhelpful, and all it does is stigmatise people's journey when they're trying to receive help. But really, when you look at most of those histories, you could probably just say it's complex trauma or complex PTSD, whatever else you want to label it as. But you could actually give it a much more compassionate and helpful label if you wanted to in terms of getting services. So most people identified mental health impacts, and that went through from anxiety and depression right through to eating disorders, triggers for psychosis, drug use, all of those sorts of things. So it was basically a risk factor for anything. Most people also describe difficulties with interpersonal relationships. And I think I just want to highlight the point here. A lot of adults reflecting back on their experiences said it was really hard to them, really hard for them to know what good personal boundaries were. They really struggled with that, and they really didn't know how to respond to other people in terms of personal boundaries. And ultimately, for men in particular, they said the easiest way to deal with this was to work in complete isolation. So never actually connecting with anyone, because their attempts to connect failed badly or got them into trouble. And so it was easy to actually just withdraw and become completely isolated. And there were a lot of women who said the same thing. There's also a lot of poor educational outcomes, and so people don't do well in school, and then they don't do well in life. It's hard to get reasonably paid jobs. Some people did go back to education, but of course it's much harder to make up for what you've missed in childhood. So we need to make sure that when children are coming through our mental health services, for example, that we actually address the educational outcomes, because I don't think we really do that very well in our current education systems. And a lot of people also spoke about the difficulties with knowing what physical intimacy was really about, and what real affection or love actually meant. Some people confused love with sexual activity and couldn't actually differentiate between the two of what that actually meant. So it really messes up that psychosocial development as well. We also know about developmental trauma and health. I'm sure you all know about the ACEs study. We won't spend much time on this, but if you could actually deal with child trauma better, all of these later impacts could be significantly reduced. And for a lot of the people that you're seeing in mental health services, part of the burden of the poor health that they experience and the shortened life expectancy is not just about the medications and the illness, but also about the previous adversity they experienced as children and the chronic impact of that, which we don't address very well. In terms of the impact of the institutional responses, what people told us was that how institutions respond can have a profound effect on them, that they can either have a positive or a negative effect. And I know in your report, I think, Lynn, you talked about apologies. Apologies were fraught, absolutely fraught. We had some institutions who apologised 100 times, and people just went, stop apologising. And we had other institutions who did it once, but they did it well. And the best apologies, it seemed to me, were the ones that actually considered what the person wanted to hear. So these apologies that said, I'm sorry for your distress, didn't quite cut it. Or, I'm sorry these things happened to you. What about the responsibility that they happened under their watch? What about the acknowledgement and the responsibility? What about the actual acknowledgement of the pain and suffering? So I think some apologies, and if there are going to be more apologies in the future, they need to be really well thought out, and they need to consider the perspective of the person who's been harmed in order for them to have any meaning. A lot of people told us, because we did ask the question, you know, would you want an apology? Probably half the people said no, they would see it as completely meaningless and they wouldn't believe it. And other people said, well, yes, if it was actually heartfelt and if it actually acknowledged really what happened and had some action associated with it. So the apology in or of itself was not enough if it then didn't actually lead to some kind of action. And of course, the other institutional responses that people talked about was the failure of the other services as well. So going to the police, the criminal justice system, the other complaint and oversight bodies, support services, and in particular a lot of complaints around mental health services not really dealing with the trauma or not acknowledging it or understanding it very well. The other interesting thing was that survivors told us it took on average over 20 years before they disclosed, which means that you will have potentially people in your services that are yet to talk about what happened to them as children. I found this a really sort of interesting issue about how do we make it possible for people to be able to speak up? You know, what are the elements that we require to allow people to feel safe enough to actually talk about some of the most traumatic experiences that they've ever had? And for some people, and more so for men, I think, than the women, some people said they would never have disclosed had it not been for the Royal Commission, which means that there was nothing in society that gave them any confidence or sense of safety that they could bring these issues up, or the sense that they would not be believed, and the stigma and shame associated with it was so powerful that they were never going to speak about it. One of the biggest issues for men in regard to disclosing, that was more so for men than women, was that they believed they would then be labelled as a potential perpetrator. So we need to be very careful how we handle that issue, or that association that some people who have these histories ultimately do become perpetrators, but not many. And in fact, most people who have had these issues in childhood would never go on and abuse anybody. And for some survivors, they'd spoken to us for the first time. If you looked at meaningful disclosure, though, or meaningful storytelling in regard to these very traumatic narratives, most people, that percentage would have gone up significantly. So a lot of people had actually told multiple services, multiple different institutions, but the first meaningful disclosure was to the Royal Commission. And in fact, we produced a book called Messages to Australia, which is available online. The book is held in the National Library in Canberra. And we asked people to send back a message that they wanted to let Australia know about. And overwhelmingly in the messages it was, this is the first time I've been heard. So there's something really important that how come people can tell so many different people but not have the experience of being heard? So we're missing something in what the elements are around really listening, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Have I still got a bit of time? So I'm going to talk a little bit about disclosure now. You can talk about whatever it is, whether it's disclosure, bearing witness, narrative, story, whatever. And these are just some quotes from the report itself. So the impacts of disclosure on a victim depend greatly on the response of the person to whom they are disclosing. Evidence suggests that dismissive, disbelieving, hostile or non-protective or non-supportive responses will increase the risk of negative outcomes. what people told us was that if they tried to speak up and were in any way shut down, they might not bring it up again for another 20 years. In the meantime, you've got significant impact on mental health, on families, on general health, on job security, on education. So this cumulative impact goes on while the trauma remains in that hidden state. Negative responses, as I said, may deter further disclosure, and poor responses also compromise re-traumatisation or secondary wounding. The language is really important. And again, I have to just support Lynn's findings about how we describe these things. In some cases, there were reports about sexual relationships between a staff member and a child. I mean, that's just completely inappropriate use of language, given that you can't have a sexual relationship between an adult and a child. So what we tended to do in some of this stuff was minimise and downplay what was really going on. And again, I think it goes back to that fundamental issue I raised at the very beginning. We'd rather not believe it, so if we minimise it, it might go away and we can avoid it. So we absolutely have to have language that's clear. We have to stick to it. It has to be agreed. And then we have to report in that way, and we have to be able to describe it in that way. In terms of disclosure, people often did it in a very piecemeal way. So they tested the water. They might actually complain about something else first, and this was particularly so with young people. They might disclose something else that happened to them and see how you respond to it. And if you actually acted on it rather than ignored it, they'll then tell you the next piece of information, which was actually the more critical piece. But if you don't respond to that first bit, then they think, nothing's going to happen, no one's going to believe me, why would I now trust you with something that's even more distressing for me? So there are ways in which people disclose which vary a lot. The other thing that people talked about a lot, which I think is also relevant for adult services in general, is that they talked about almost remaining as the child their whole life. So when the abuse started happening in childhood, this sort of inner child was left kind of in a developmental arrest. And we saw this quite evident in some of the private sessions where people would come in as the adult and sit down, and we'd start the session, and then they would proceed to go down into being the child again. And you could see it. They would crumple down in their seat, they would become distressed, even the language changed, and they would sometimes go back to being that child, telling the story about what actually happened to them. And then hopefully by the time we got to the end of all of that and they felt a release or a catharsis, they were then able to emerge as the adult again. And so many people reflected back to us afterwards that they felt that that was the first time the child had been heard. So sometimes when people are disclosing to you in adult services, it may seem odd what they're doing, but that's because of the nature of the developmental trauma. So even when they're describing an incident that happened to them as an adult, when those incidents happen, they go back to being the child again. Because that's the impact of the trauma on their psychological development. So all variations are possible when people are disclosing. Some children who had very, very good mechanisms for dissociation can tell you their story in a very, very cold, unemotional way. And what tends to happen when people do that is no one believes them, because it doesn't have the emotional reaction that you would expect or the state of distress that normally would accompany a recent trauma. But if someone's very good at dissociation, they're not going to have that emotional reaction. They'll be numb. So we can't judge those sorts of things and make judgments about the veracity or the truthfulness of it in this kind of setting. And a couple of other points that I just wanted to raise about what people told us in regard to their experiences of childhood that then carried through into adulthood was this issue around compliance. Many children, to survive, were compliant. They didn't consent. They just tolerated the assaults in order to not be severely beaten or to have their life threatened or to have the life of their young siblings or parents threatened or pets even sometimes. So when they're assaulted again in adulthood, they go back into that childhood compliance. So that's not consent, but people may tell you that it is, but it's not. It's an emotional and psychological reaction coming from previous trauma. Many survivors also told us that their lack of understanding about sex and sexuality as a child contributed them to be vulnerable sort of lifelong, and some of them never ever got that education. In fact, they missed out on a lot of it. And they described how they felt confused about what was happening to them and did not understand that it was actually an assault. And that also followed them into adulthood as well, not knowing what the reasonable boundaries were in a personal relationship and whether it was actually an assault that they were experiencing or not. So that's why it's so difficult to make a judgment about it. In terms of re-victimisation, we've already heard a little bit about that from the previous speaker. But clearly, child sexual abuse is a significant risk for people being re-victimised later in adult life. And there's a large-scale study there that showed that if you were a victim of sexual abuse in childhood, then you're far more likely, 4 times more likely to experience threats of violence and 5 times greater risk of sexual assault into adulthood. The other thing that some people also told us is that they sort of just almost accommodated to the abuse and almost had an expectation it was just going to continue. And so there's this kind of like terrible acceptance that this was going to be their lot in life, and they weren't empowered enough or had enough self-esteem to be able to stop that ongoing abuse. And so the level of vulnerability of the people that you're seeing in adult services, whether it's male or female, is extremely high if they've had these sorts of histories. One survivor called it the scent of abuse. So you wear a bit of vulnerability all over you, and it makes you a likely candidate for other people who are looking for someone who's not going to speak up or someone who's not going to resist. And then one of the final comments was that some victims have grown up in an environment of repeated and prolonged abuse. They may have such low self-esteem and may not feel entitled to safety and respect. And of course, they're likely to be targeted then for further assault. But being able to talk about trauma, being able to release that burden, being able to talk about it in a powerful way and being heard is incredibly powerful. And this is the point that I want to make. We may not want to deal with this. We may prefer if it just went away. But in fact, if you engage with it, if you learn how to listen well and you deal with it effectively, it can be absolutely pivotal in a person's life journey. And it can be life-changing at that moment. It may not in itself be therapy, but it is therapeutic. And I think that that's the one thing I've learnt from the Royal Commission. Well, I've learnt lots of things actually, but one thing that was really powerful that I've learnt was that I just thought, people coming and telling people that they didn't know in a private room their terrible stories, I didn't think it would be that powerful for them. I really, really didn't. I thought it would be important, but I didn't think it would be that powerful, but it was. And we've had people even years later who disclosed to us in the early part of the commission, we went for 5 years, still talk about the positive effect that it had. So we must take some of that learning and apply it, because that's a win-win, isn't it? That's a win-win if we can, well, we should be preventing it, of course, but if we can make this possible and we can make it as powerful as it can be, then we're doing a good thing. And this person talked about actually being heard and then actually being the child starting on their journey of development. And in some respects, that's what it's like. Until that trauma burden is released, until a secret is disclosed, they don't develop. And so that allowed this person to go on. When we looked at support services, people who have these sorts of experiences in childhood end up needing a whole pile of support services in health, housing, legal, and in particular in mental health. And so do their families and carers. The support service system includes mainstream community support, specialist services, but in particular mental health services featured really strongly. Keep going. Wrap up? Okay, a few more minutes. Okay, so what we found out was that the service system had an inconsistent level of knowledge, that the availability of expertise to work with trauma was poor, that there was limited professional development for staff and limited collaboration. I'll just get through some of these and I'll just get to the end bit. So we know about all of this, the risk for the impact on mental health and the issues around fear and rage and risky behaviours and shame and guilt, all of those sorts of things all form part and parcel of people's experience, and then those things are often compounded as they go through mental health services. Some of just the learnings from the private sessions was some of the things that made the biggest difference was having a safe person to talk to. Are we safe in mental health services when people talk to us? Enduring relationships, having hope, mastery and purpose. And we've already discussed briefly about the healing journeys, the transition points, and also the turning points that we can actually make use of for people in order to help their recovery. I'm not going to go through that. So I'm just going to go through these last couple of slides. Do we have the right starting point? Do we have the atmosphere, the environment and the privacy, the dignity, the respect and the regard? Do we have enough compassion that people feel safe in order to be able to speak to us when they come into our services? If you went back to your service environment today, would you be comfortable in discussing deeply traumatic and personal stories? Or would you look around and go, I'm not telling anybody anything in this setting? How is the right to safety conveyed? Are protective behaviours, the protective behaviours equivalent from what we teach children, is that actually used in mental health services for adults who come with these issues around their own boundaries, their own vulnerabilities, their own difficulties in being able to actually keep their personal boundaries? Do we help them with that, or do we just tell them they've got rights? One of the things that we found with young people was they kept saying to us, everyone keeps telling us we need to tell someone, no one tells us how to go about it, what to say, how to bring it up. So I think we need to get more concrete here and give people actual skills and tools in being able to raise these issues. And how do we reduce the re-traumatisation and the triggers in the inpatient settings? Bearing of witness. Do we really know how to do that? The thing that I learnt was that when I was a psychiatrist and I thought I was a really good listener, was that I only listened with half my brain. Because the other half of the brain was going tick box, diagnosis, formulation, risk management, unconscious processes, transference, current transference, blah, 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 a lot of noise. So you get premature closure. You don't really listen. That part's listening and attending. And so you do your paraphrasing. We all learn how to paraphrase. And you don't mount a genuine human response, which is, oh my God, that is just awful. You go, wow, that must have caused distress. You can see the difference. It's not genuine. We need to down our tools, clear the brain. And if someone wants to tell us something that deeply personal, we have to be fully present, fully engage with what's going on and have a human response to the story that we've just heard. So all of those things are true. It can be life-changing. Well, you don't know what you're going to hear either. You don't know whether this is a one-off incident, an incident that's based on multiple traumas in the past, an incident that's in the context of current abuse that's going on in the person's private life. So you've got to be there and ready for anything. We also need to manage then the distress that comes from that, both for the person and for the person receiving the story. We've got to understand the vicarious traumatisation and the compassion fatigue that are in services. Let's face it, this is hard stuff. It takes its toll. It takes its toll on all of us, and I can tell you, after 5 years of a Royal Commission, it took its toll on all of us. So we need to have those supports in place, because if we're not doing it well, how do we expect our survivors who are coming to us to have a good outcome? I probably don't have any more time left, do I?
Q&A. I'm going to do Q&A with you.
Okay.
And yes,
So Safe Journeys are about...
Please do. Take a couple.
Okay, a couple more minutes. There's just one other thing I wanted to tackle, and I can leave the rest and you can just have a look at it online. When we do a psychiatric interview, we ask, what's wrong? What's wrong with your family? Then we tell them what's wrong. Then we tell them what to do. I don't think that's a trauma-informed care approach. What we did in the Royal Commission in terms of listening to the stories was we just had a free narrative. So we just allowed the person to tell their story at their own pace. And we heard the whole life story. And at the end of that, I felt pretty able to do a pretty good formulation, if I had to have a pretty good appreciation of what was really going on. I didn't need to be interrogative. I mean, I could have then gone and asked a few, questions to clarify. But I think that we've got it wrong in terms of the way we bring people in. And we're talking about trauma-informed care, but we're talking about trauma-informed care upon a model that's not trauma-informed. So I don't know how we kind of merge the two together. I think we need to develop more of a free narrative style, even if just for part of the interview, so that people have the opportunity to say what they really want to say. You also learn much more about the person's strengths and their vulnerabilities through a free narrative approach than you do in a step-by-step psychiatric interview. And I thought I did it well, but I think I'm going to learn how to do it better. And then we need to get past trauma-informed care. I don't have any problems with the separate sexual assault services, but for God's sake, we're mental health services, we're psychiatric services. Aren't we meant to know about this? For someone to say, I'm just here to deal with your depression. You need to go and deal with your trauma somewhere else. When it's the trauma that's driving, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the burnout, the distress, come on. Let's just deal with it. Let's become trauma competent as well as trauma informed in our approaches. And if you don't want to be a trauma therapist, that's fine. But make sure you at least know how to deal with it within whatever service that you're working within, and at least incorporate it into your management plans. There's nothing more distressing than going and reviewing a case file, seeing all of this trauma in the background, and it's not even mentioned in the formulation or in the management plan. What do we think we're actually treating here, given that so many of the people coming to our services have this in their background? So this is another quote from a survivor. There must be change. I'll just finish with this. We need to help people be able to tell their story in the right way, within strong relationships that are safe in mental health services, through understanding their context of their lives in our present systems, through a cultural lens, with a responsive service system, with the trauma-informed and competent care that we should all be able to provide, and within a compassionate society. Then we can tell a better story. Thank you.